Hi everyone, welcome to our first lecture of Block 4, our first lecture over the respiratory system. We're going to learn about the structure and function of the nasal cavity, the bronchial tree, and the lungs, as well as how different gases get transported around our body. In this first lecture, we are primarily going to be looking at some anatomy of the respiratory system and laying the foundation for the upcoming lectures. But as always, let's get started with our not really attendance questions. First, what is the function of simple squamous epithelium? Next, what is the serous membrane around the lungs? And third, what is a macrophage? Go ahead and pause the video, try to answer those questions before we move on. Okay, hopefully you've done that, so let's take a look at the correct answers. Now these, all three, require us to go pretty far back. We're going back to the early parts of Bio 137 for the first two questions, and early on in this chapter, or in this class, for the third question. So, what is the function of simple squamous epithelium? Remember, simple squamous epithelium, it's a single layer of very flat, very squashed cells, and the function was to make diffusion really easy, really efficient. Next, what is the serous membrane around the lungs? Remember, serous membranes are those double layer membranes that surround all of the organs in our thoracic cavity, inside our chest, and in our abdominopelvic cavity. So around the lungs, we called that membrane the pleura, or the pleural membrane. And lastly, what is a macrophage? Remember, a macrophage was a type of white blood cell. It begins as a monocyte, but when it leaves the bloodstream, it changes a little bit and becomes a macrophage, which wanders through various tissues looking for things that don't belong there so that it can eat that or phagocytize it. All of those things will come up in today's lecture. So if we're talking about the respiratory system, we are obviously talking about respiration. And respiration is something that we've all talked about, but maybe we don't all really know exactly what all is involved in respiration. So respiration actually has several components. The first is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is just the act of breathing. It is the movement of air in and out of the lungs. It's inhaling and exhaling. Together, both of those make up pulmonary ventilation. Once we have moved air into the lungs, well, the next thing that goes into respiration is external respiration. So external respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood inside the lungs, or arriving at the lungs. Now, it's called external respiration because if you had me for Bio 137, you probably heard me say this, but it's important to realize, even if you didn't have me, the inside of the lungs, it's actually outside the body. That's a little tricky for some people to wrap their head around, but just imagine if you open your mouth wide and you lean your head back, everything inside your lungs is exposed to the outside environment. The inside of your lungs is really outside of your body. So that's why we call that exchange of gases between the blood and the lungs external respiration. Well, once we have loaded the blood down with oxygen at the lungs, we need to take that oxygen to the tissues of the body. So the transport of gases. When we're talking transport of gases, really what we're saying is we're taking oxygen away from the lungs to deliver to the tissues. And then once we get to the tissues, we're going to pick up carbon dioxide and drop off oxygen so that we can then take that carbon dioxide away from the tissues to the lungs. So the actual transport of gases between the lungs and the tissues using the bloodstream, that's part of respiration. But then I just mentioned what happens at the tissues. At the tissues, we drop off oxygen and we pick up carbon dioxide waste. So we are exchanging gases at the tissues. That is internal respiration. Internal respiration is the exchange of gases between the blood and the tissues. And there's one more step that is not on here, and that's because we actually already covered it back in Bio 137, and that's cellular respiration. What do we do once we get the oxygen to the tissues? Well, we use that oxygen and glucose to make ATP that our body runs on. Cellular respiration. All right, so now let's start looking at the anatomy of the respiratory system. And usually the first thing we think about when we talk about the respiratory system, we think about the lungs. But we actually begin the anatomy of the respiratory system way before we get to the lungs. It begins inside your face, and that's what we're looking at right here. We are looking at a mid-sagittal view of the inside of the nose and the mouth. So right here is inside the nasal cavity. Here's the tip of the nose. Here's the tongue. So we're looking inside the mouth, and then down through here, this is the throat, just to kind of orient everyone. So first, inside the nose, this is the nasal cavity. Now, I'm sure at some point everyone has looked up their nose with their mirror. Sometimes it could be a little gross, but the reason that I say that is because there's actually a lot more going on in your nose than just the two holes, the nostrils or the nares at the end of it, just on your face. So let's think about what happens inside if we go up into a nostril. Well, your two nostrils are separated by a plate of connective tissue called the nasal septum. But the nasal septum does not go extremely far back. It's actually, once you get to the rear of the nose, it's all one big cavity. So your left and your right nostril do connect to each other deep inside your face. And that area inside the nose is called the nasal cavity. And when we breathe in through the nose, it actually has some functionality to it. First, there are lots of nose hairs, which is, most people don't like to think about nose hairs, especially when they kind of stick out a little bit and you could see them when you're talking to someone. But nose hairs actually serve an important function. They block large debris when you breathe it in. And the inside of our nose is typically a little moist, and that also helps catch debris that we breathe in through the nose. It's actually better to breathe in through your nose than through your mouth because your nose has a lot of protective mechanism inside to help block stuff from being breathed into your lungs. So part of the functionality of the nose and the nasal cavity is to filter the air that we breathe. Also, as we breathe in, part of the inside of the nose, there are these things called nasal meatuses or nasal concha, which are these folds and gaps inside the nose. And they make the inside of the nose kind of unsmooth or rough, so that when we breathe air in, it creates a little bit of turbulence. It slows the air down. And what happens when it slows it down is it allows the air to get moistened and filtered a little bit more and warmed up a little bit. Especially if you go out on a cold day, sometimes if you breathe in too quickly, it can kind of burn your throat because the air's too cold. Well, when you breathe in through your nose, it moves around and it has time to warm before it goes down towards your lungs. So the nose and the nasal cavity warm, moisten, and filter the air. And then we also have these things called paranasal sinuses. And paranasal sinuses are really, we saw them kind of back in Bio 137 when we were studying the skull. They are part of the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, the vomer, part of the maxilla. Those bones all have some open space. And really, when the skull's all put together as it is in a living person, they're all connected and they have these open spaces right here and right here. Even part of your frontal bone has some of these sinuses. And the sinuses have a few jobs. First, more related to Bio 137, they make your skull lighter. Your skull, there's a lot of bone in your skull, and it would get really, really heavy very quickly. So it is filled with these open spaces, and those open spaces help lighten the skull. But the sinuses also, since they have this epithelial tissue kind of lining the surface, they also help with warming and moistening the air. Now, next, we're going to talk about something called the pharynx. The pharynx is the shared cavity at the back of the nose, mouth, and throat. So this whole area right here that I'm tracing with the pointer is the pharynx. The pharynx is the shared cavity at the nose, mouth, and throat. And the pharynx has three different areas. At the back of the nose, it's called the nasopharynx. At the back of the mouth, it's called the oropharynx. And at the back of the throat, below the mouth, it's called the laryngopharynx. And they are made up of some different tissue. They have a little bit of different functionality that kind of overlaps. So let's start up here at the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is primarily pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which kind of, if you think back to Bio 137, what was the function? Well, it helps create mucus, which is a good thing inside your nose and in the back of your throat. It also has the cilia to help catch stuff and move it along. So it's primarily pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And we have the uvula or the uvula, which is part of the roof of your mouth, part of the soft palate that hangs down at the back. It's that little punching bag looking thing at the back of your throat. When we swallow, that folds up and it blocks the passage so that when let's say we're taking a drink of something, if we didn't have the uvula, well, that as we swallow, some of that liquid could go up and some of that liquid could go down. And as the liquid goes down, it's directed into the esophagus. If it goes up, it would get into your nose. Well, I'm sure we've all seen or even experienced if you're laughing when you take a drink. Well, when we laugh and you take a drink, it interferes with the action of the uvula. And the uvula does not fold up properly, so it doesn't block it off. And the result is what happens when you take a drink of milk and you laugh? Well, it comes spraying out your nose. That's because laughing interferes with the uvula. Now, also, here in the very back of the nasal cavity, there's something called a pharyngeal tonsil. And tonsils, regardless of which tonsils we're talking about, because there are several, tonsils act as part of our lymphatic system and work with our immune system. They trap things that come into the body and allow our immune system to be exposed to it. So when we breathe things in, stuff in the air, whether it's debris or smaller things, viruses, bacteria, something like that, when we breathe it in, some of it gets caught in this pharyngeal tonsil, allowing our immune system to be exposed to it. Now, as we move further down, we get to the back of the mouth. And the back of the mouth is called the oropharynx. And it is mostly composed of stratified squamous epithelium. Remember, stratified squamous epithelium is there to provide resistance to abrasion, and it's in areas where we have a lot of friction. Well, we're constantly swallowing food, and when we swallow that food, regardless of how well we chew it up, it's brushing and rubbing against the back of the throat, the back of the mouth. So that stratified squamous epithelium helps with that. And at the back of the mouth, we have two sets of tonsils. We have the palatine tonsils right near the back of the mouth on each side. And we also, at the back surface of the tongue, we have the lingual tonsils. These both are exposed to anything that we breathe in through our mouth or swallow. And they do exactly the same thing that the pharyngeal tonsils did. They get pieces of whatever come in through our mouth brushed up against them. We expose our immune system to whatever's coming in through our mouth. Well, we go a little further down. Now we are below the back of the mouth, so we're the upper part of the throat. This is the laryngopharynx. And the laryngopharynx is primarily stratified squamous epithelium, just like the back of the oropharynx, because again, everything that we swallow is passing through the laryngopharynx. Now, the laryngopharynx, this is where things split. There are actually two tubes that go down through our throat, and they split at the laryngopharynx. The posterior side of the laryngopharynx, so the back portion of our throat, right up against our spinal column actually, this is the esophagus. The laryngopharynx is continuous with the esophagus. This is the tube that delivers food towards our stomach. And the front part, the anterior part, enters towards the larynx and eventually the trachea. So everything that goes in through our nose or in through our mouth, if it's food, if it's drink, it's going to be directed into the esophagus. If it's air, it's going to be directed into the larynx and into the trachea. We will see how that happens in just a moment. But first, let's go here and have a thinking cap question. People with sinus problems often develop ear infections soon after. Why is that? Let's see if we can think of an answer for this. Well, let's go back to our diagram here. And if we look at the back of the nose, there's a little opening right here. And this opening is called the opening of the pharyngotympanic tube, which more people know as the eustachian tube. Remember when we studied the ear model in Bio 137, there was one tube that kind of curved downward? Well, that tube actually connects to the back of the nose at the top of the throat area. So the nasal cavity and the inner ear are continuous with each other through that tube. This allows pressure of the inner ear to remain equal to pressure in the environment. This is why when you feel like your ears are a little stuffed up, what do? You yawn or you open your mouth wide and you hear that kind of pop noise. Well, that's the eustachian tube opening up. Sometimes it closes off, but it opens up if you stretch your throat, because right there is where it opens. But while that is there to help equalize pressure, it's also a very direct pathway between the back of the nose next to the sinuses and the inner ear. So if you get a sinus infection and you're all cruddy and snotty, well, it loads up with bacteria, and some of those bacteria can make their way to the ear through that eustachian tube. And that's why it's often the case that if you have a sinus infection, right after that, you'll get an ear infection. And sometimes it goes the other way. If you get an ear infection, sometimes it can spread to your sinuses, although it's more often that it starts in your sinuses. All right, so let's talk about a couple of disorders. First is rhinitis. Anytime you see itis, I-T-I-S, at the end of a word, it means inflammation or infection of. And I always like to point out when we get to this point, think back to diabetes mellitus. It is not diabetes mellitus. It is not an infection or an inflammation. Diabetes mellitus, I-T-U-S, is not diabetes mellitus, because itis or itis, that is infection or inflammation. So rhinitis is the infection or inflammation of the nose. R-H-I-N means nose. Rhinoceros means nose horn. Rhinoplasty is an operation on the nose, sometimes just called a nose job. Well, rhinitis is infection of the nose, but more commonly, this is what we refer to as the common cold. Rhinitis is the actual condition that we just refer to as a cold. Sinusitis, well, now that we know what itis means, what is sinusitis? It's a sinus infection like we just talked about. So a sinus infection is sinusitis, the common cold is rhinositis. And this picture, I put it in just because it's gross, it looks terrible, but there's a neat story behind it. Most of us have probably heard of it, but just in case, this is why we say bless you. Long, long ago, when someone would be standing in just the right kind of light and they would sneeze, and for whatever reason, the way this guy is doing, they would not sneeze into their elbow to prevent the spread of nastiness like we see here. This is what comes out of your face every time you sneeze. This is why you don't sneeze into your hands, because then everything you touch is covered in your snot. This is why we sneeze into your elbow. But in just the right light, it looks like this. And people used to think when you sneezed and this happened, they thought that this was your soul being pushed out of your body, and they would bless you to get the soul to go back in. That's why we say bless you, because people used to think that was your soul leaving your body every time you sneezed, which for me would be terrible because I have awful hay fever allergies and I'm sneezing year round. All right, so now we're going to move a little bit lower. We're going into the lower parts of the respiratory system, and we're going to begin with the throat area just below what we just talked about. Now, this is the larynx and the upper part of the trachea. The larynx is commonly called the Adam's apple. And it is a complete misconception that only males have Adam's apples. Everybody has a larynx. Everybody has an Adam's apple, as we call it. It's just typically, but not always, they are a little bit larger and more prominent in males. That is not always the case. It's just more common. So here is the larynx, and in this view, anterior is to the left, to the right, and posterior is to the left. All right, so right here is the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a little kind of stiff structure that sticks up from the larynx. And the larynx itself is hyaline cartilage. And hyaline cartilage, it's pretty stiff, so it holds the airway open. And the epiglottis, when we swallow, it folds down a little bit and our larynx moves up a little bit, and the result is the epiglottis blocks the opening into the larynx and the trachea. That is because we don't want food or liquid going down towards our lungs. Instead, that forces the food or liquid to go the other route, which we saw in the other image, goes towards the esophagus. We'll see another picture of that in just a moment, but just know that the hyaline cartilage of the larynx holds the airway open and the epiglottis closes it when we swallow. So it directs food into the esophagus and air into the larynx. Now, just inside the larynx, another name for the larynx is the voice box. If you've ever heard that term, that's what it's talking about. And that's because inside the larynx, there are some folds of tissue, very, very thin. They almost look like rubber bands made of skin or muscle or something. If you come to see our cadaver, you can actually see these vocal cords. So these, as air moves out, they are, we can stiffen them, and when we stiffen them a little bit, they vibrate as air comes out, and that's how we produce speech. Even though you're not thinking about it, when you are talking, you are slightly stiffening your vocal cords so that air coming through will vibrate them. And then we move our tongue and our mouth and our jaws so that the sound created by the vibrating vocal cords comes out as words. Well, there's another set of vocal cords that don't really play any role in speech. So now let's go back to the vocal cords that do. Instead of just calling them vocal cords, most of the time we call them true vocal cords, which means that the other ones that don't produce speech are called false vocal cords. So what do? Well, they kind of do the same thing the epiglottis does. They fold shut so that anything small enough that gets through is still blocked from entering into the trachea and moving down towards the lungs. Now, the larynx is primarily lined with stratified squamous epithelium, but right below the vocal cords, there's actually quite a bit of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and then that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium continues to increase and go on all the way down through the trachea. Now, here's another disorder term to learn, laryngitis. Again, inflammation and infection of something, of the larynx. But really not so much the whole larynx. It tends to most commonly hit the vocal cords, and that's why usually with laryngitis, someone will lose their voice or become very, very hoarse, because it causes them to be inflamed and swollen, and they don't tighten up as well, they don't vibrate as well. All right, so now instead of a cross section, now we are looking down into the throat. And here, this is the front of the neck throat area. Back here is the back of the neck throat area. So here is the edge of the trachea, the windpipe. Right behind it, here is the esophagus. So when we look down, we can see that the esophagus is posterior to or behind the trachea. So food goes towards the back, air goes towards the front is one way to think about it. But if we look at the inside of the trachea, we can see it's quite open. It's very large. And this blue structure right here is more hyaline cartilage. As we move down into the trachea, what we have are these C-shaped hyaline cartilage rings. We're going to see why that's important in just a moment. But here in the middle, this is the open area. This is where the air passes. And remember the generic term for the open area of a hollow organ? We say it is the lumen. So this is the lumen of the trachea. And if we look all the way around the edge of the trachea, we see these little hairs sticking out. And that is because the trachea is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. As a matter of fact, when we looked in Bio 137 at this tissue, we were looking at the inside of the trachea. Now, it's hard to see any in this image. That might be one right there, but there are goblet cells. There are cilia. There are these large open things called seromucus glands. All of this helps the trachea do its job well. So let's start at the inside of the trachea and work our way outward. We said here is cilia, and there are some goblet cells there. Goblet cells, remember, they produce mucus. So the inside of the trachea is lined with mucus, and then those cilia move that mucus upward, so going up from the lungs towards the back of the mouth. As we breathe debris in, it gets caught in that mucus. And then the cilia move the mucus up and we cough it out. Also, these seromucus glands in the next layer out, called the adventitia, we have the submucosal layer. The submucosal layer is where we find the seromucus glands. They also produce mucus, but it's more of a sheet-like mucus instead of just straight mucus. This is more clinging together. It has more of a lining property instead of the mucus that gets moved upward. But when you smoke, if you smoke, what happens is it first burns away the cilia, and then it begins to destroy the goblet cells and the seromucus glands. That's why smokers tend to have a very dry, hacking cough. Well, dry because there's no mucus there. And since there's no mucus to trap the debris, and there's no cilia to move the mucus, what ends up happening is everything that a smoker breathes in goes straight into the lungs. It doesn't get trapped. It doesn't get coughed out. And that just makes smoking that much worse than the smoke itself. Now, I mentioned a moment ago this C-shaped hyaline cartilage. As you go downward through the trachea, it has these rings. So it's ring space, ring space, ring space, all the way down the trachea. And each one is C-shaped. It is not O-shaped. It is not a complete circle. It is C-shaped. The back does not meet, and that's important. Why might that be? Well, we said hyaline cartilage, or just cartilage in general, is pretty stiff. So the hyaline cartilage having this C shape holds the trachea open. It keeps it open for air to move through. If it were a complete ring, well, it would make the trachea circular and very, very sturdy. So that would be great for the trachea. But it would not be so great for the esophagus. Think about what your esophagus is regularly doing. Every time we swallow food, the esophagus has to expand a little bit as that food moves through. If the hyaline cartilage was a full circular ring, the esophagus could not expand. And then the food that you swallowed would get stuck partway down the esophagus. But by having a C-shaped ring, it allows the esophagus to expand a little bit and let the food move on down towards the stomach. So here we can see the trachea, and we could see those C-shaped rings here. But as we get all the way down to the base, the trachea splits. And now we have smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller tubes going deeper and deeper and deeper into the lungs. So here we have the right lung and the left lung. And as we move down the trachea and into all of these smaller tubes, this is called the conducting zone. So all these tubes collectively called the bronchial tree because it looks like a tree that's upside down, this being the trunk and then all the limbs of the tree. But the conducting zone is the part of the bronchial tree that is involved with moving gases. The conducting zone is involved with or concerned with moving gases. And the parts of the bronchial tree, well, we just saw the trachea, but now we're going towards each lung. So the trachea splits into two pretty large tubes. This is called the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. So bronchi, the left and the right primary bronchus, are going to split. The right one splits into 3. The left one splits into 2 secondary bronchi. The right splits into 3. The left splits into 2. And then they split into even more and even more. So we say primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, quaternary bronchi, and they just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller as they branch. But let's see exactly what the difference in some of these bronchi are. As we move from the trachea into the two primary bronchi, well, the right primary bronchus carries air into the right lung. The left primary bronchus carries air to the left lung. And then when we get to the secondary bronchi, we said the right has 3 and the left has 2. Well, each of these secondary bronchi carry air to one of the lobes of the lung. On the right, we have 3 lobes. Here we have one secondary bronchus carrying air to the superior lobe of the right lung. Here we have a secondary bronchus carrying air to the inferior lobe of the right lung. And here we have a secondary bronchus carrying air to the middle lobe of the right lung. Over on the left side, we have a primary bronchus carrying air to the superior lobe of the left lung, and a secondary bronchus carrying air to the inferior lobe of the left lung. The left lung only has 2. It's a little bit smaller than the right lung. Why would that be? Why would the left lung have fewer lobes and be smaller than the right lung? Well, even though the heart is right in the middle of the chest, remember the left side of the heart is bigger. It extends more into the left side of the chest and it displaces the lung a little bit. So the left lung is smaller and has fewer lobes. Now, it is not extremely uncommon for the right lung to also only have 2 lobes. It's still going to be a little bit bigger than the left, but it usually has 3. All right, so we've moved down through all of the different bronchi, and at some point, the bronchi are going to get so small that we call them bronchioles. Bronchioles are just really small bronchi. They are so small, they are about 1 millimeter or smaller in diameter. Bronchioles are 1 millimeter or smaller in diameter. And they continue to branch and branch and branch and get smaller until they get to the very, very end of the line, and we call these terminal bronchioles, and they are smaller than 0.5 millimeter in diameter. So the deeper we go, the anatomy of these structures change. The deeper we go, we see some anatomical changes. Those C-shaped cartilages become cartilage plates that are spaced irregularly. Deeper and deeper and deeper, those irregular plates eventually become smooth muscle. There is smooth muscle all the way down, but the deeper you go, the cartilage gets less regular and then is eventually completely replaced by smooth muscle entirely. The lining, the inside, the mucosal layer on the inside of these tubes, we said it begins as pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. But the deeper we go, it transitions to columnar epithelium, simple columnar epithelium, and then eventually to simple cuboidal epithelium. So now we are down past the conducting zone and we have reached the respiratory zone. Now the respiratory zone is concerned with exchange of gases. This is where oxygen that we breathe in moves from the lungs into the blood, and where carbon dioxide waste moves from the blood into the lungs. So here we can see where we have reached the respiratory zone. Here we have blown it up a little bit. So here's that terminal bronchiole that we just had, part of the respiratory zone. But once we get past the terminal bronchiole, we see that smooth muscle stops. And we move into this structure right here that looks kind of like a whole bunch of balloons stuck to a stick or something like that. Or a cluster of grapes. And this is where gas exchange takes place. So coming out of the terminal bronchiole, we lose that smooth muscle, and we are now in the respiratory bronchiole. The respiratory bronchiole is simple squamous epithelium. It carries air up into this cluster, into something called an alveolar duct. An alveolar duct is what actually connects the respiratory bronchiole to the alveoli and carries air into the alveoli. This big cluster of alveoli is called an alveolar sac. And when we breathe in, these alveoli expand like balloons and then deflate like a balloon, and then expand like a balloon and deflate like a balloon. So these are, each one of these little spheres is called an alveolus. Lots of them are called alveoli. If we cut through to see inside, that's what we see down here in the bottom right. So here is that alveolar duct carrying air in. We could see the alveoli are actually connected to each other through these little pores called alveolar pores. Air moves into all of these alveoli and they all expand when we inhale. And then when we exhale, air moves out. So air is constantly moving in and out of the alveoli every time we breathe. Here is an actual microscope slide of some alveoli. All of these little ring structures, these are the alveoli, and we can see they're all connected. But we can also see a respiratory bronchiole. We can see it's much thicker. But let's look at another view. Let's look at something called the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is actually what the gas has to cross during that exchange of gases. So now we can see more correctly what an alveolus would look like. Here let me go back to the previous picture. Here we can see the alveoli really, really well. But in reality, the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. Remember, capillaries is where fluid exchange takes place. So we have the blood coming in through an arteriole, then it moves through the capillary where gas exchange takes place, and then it leaves through a venule. So Here, where this gas exchange takes place, it is where a capillary lies directly on the surface of an alveolus. If we cut it open, here we can see the alveolus, we can see inside of it, we can see the alveolar pores, and then we can see cross sections of capillaries. So we can see that the wall of the capillary and the wall of an alveolus, it's only 2 layers thick. Both of them are simple squamous epithelium. So this is an incredibly thin wall right here. 2 very thin layers thick. This is the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is the wall of the alveolus, the wall of the capillary. It makes it really easy for carbon dioxide and oxygen to diffuse across. Either oxygen from the alveolus into the blood or CO2 from the blood into the alveolus. So here inside the alveolus, let's look at the different cell types that we would see. Most of what we see is simple squamous epithelium. And simple squamous epithelium inside of an alveolus we call a type 1 cell. Type 1 cells, the majority of an alveolar wall, type 1 cells are simple squamous epithelium. Remember what simple squamous epithelium did? It made diffusion, in this case diffusion of gases, really easy, really efficient. But here and there, in this image, these green guys right here, these are called type 2 cells. Type 2 cells are simple cuboidal epithelium. Not really noticeable in this image, but they are simple cuboidal epithelium. Think back to what simple cuboidal epithelium did from Bio 137. It was involved in absorption and secretion. Well, here, secretion is the big job. Type 2 cells are going to secrete something called surfactant. Surfactant. And surfactant is, another name for it is detergent, which we usually associate with soap, but that's not what it means here. So let's think. We want the inside of our lungs to be pretty moist. We don't want them to dry out. That would be very bad. So they are constantly moist. And every time we inhale and every time we exhale, the alveoli expand and deflate, expand and deflate. Well, if these are moist, what do you think the majority of that moisture is? Well, when we're talking about the inside of the body, it's always a good guess to say water. And that's correct. Most of what is keeping our lungs moist is water. And think about some of the properties of water. Water likes to stick to everything, including other water. That's what surface tension is. If you've ever flicked water on a wall and it sticks to the wall, that's because of surface tension. If you ever fill a glass up and then you add a little bit too much, you can see that the water actually mounds up over the top of the glass. That's because of surface tension. Water likes to stick to itself. Well, usually that's a good thing, but in the lungs, not so much. When we inhale and the alveoli expand, that's good. When they exhale and they deflate, well, now that moisture, those water droplets, want to stick to other water droplets. And surface tension could form. And if surface tension forms around a deflated alveolus, it's going to take a lot of effort to inflate it again. And it would make breathing very, very tiring because we would have to exert a lot of energy to breathe. Well, type 2 cells secrete surfactant. Surfactant decreases surface tension. It keeps that shell from forming. So when the alveoli deflate, it's very easy to re-inflate them. So type 2 cells, simple cuboidal epithelium, secrete surfactant. Here we can see those pores that I was talking about that allow air to move from one alveolus into the neighboring alveolus. These kind of ruffly looking guys, these are macrophages or alveolar macrophages. They're constantly moving around inside your alveoli, looking for things that somehow made it into your lungs. So now, moving out to the outside of the lungs, we have those pleura that we were talking about. We learned about them in Bio 137. We said that a pleural membrane, or any serous membrane, is a two-layer membrane around the surface of organs. The inner layer is called the parietal layer, and it lies directly on the surface of the organ that it's surrounding. So the parietal pleura lies directly on the surface of a lung. The visceral pleura is the outer layer, and it lies against the chest wall, or the inside cavity of your rib cage. The space in between is called the pleural space, and it is filled with pleural fluid. Pleural fluid is a lubricant. It keeps those two layers, the visceral and parietal pleura, from irritating each other. Think, every time you take a breath, your lungs inflate and deflate, inflate and deflate. Those two layers, the parietal and visceral pleura, rub against each other with every single breath. But pleural fluid acts as a lubricant. It keeps them from irritating each other as they rub together. There is a disorder called pleurisy where you don't have enough pleural fluid. And they do irritate each other. And it actually can feel like a heart attack. Quite a few people that make it to the emergency room thinking they're having a heart attack are actually suffering from pleurisy. And if we go the opposite direction, if we have too much pleural fluid, well, that's going to cause something called a pleural effusion. A pleural effusion is what happens when too much pleural fluid is in that pleural cavity, or the pleural space. And here, now it's going to push on the lung. It's going to squeeze the lung or crush it down. And that's what we see happening over here on the right side. All right. So that brings us to the end of the anatomy section. I know that was a little bit of a long lecture, but hopefully it wasn't really difficult material for you. It was mostly just introducing some of the structures. In our next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about physics and how we breathe. So it's not just a matter of inhale, exhale. We're going to see the exact hows of how we inhale and how we exhale at the physics level of things. So hopefully you are ready for that when we get there, and I will talk to you next time.